Jew in Jerusalem. And all the people in Jerusalem know this. He says, who knew me from the beginning, if they would testify that after the strictest sect of the religion I lived a Pharisee. In other words, out of all the groups of people who follow the Jewish laws and so on, the Pharisees are the strictest. And in the Pharisees, they were even a strict sect, and I was a member of that. In fact, if we look at his history, etc., he was probably the one being groomed to be the number one Jew concerning the law in Jerusalem. He was a graduate of Gamaliel school. He says, and now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made of God unto our fathers. He says, I'm being judged because I believe the promises that God made in the Old Testament. He says that were made unto our fathers. He says, in other words, he says, I studied the Old Testament and I understood the promises. He says this, unto which the promise our 12 tribes, earnestly serving God day and night, hope to come, for which hope, say King Agrippa, I am accused by the Jews. Now, the hope was the hope of the resurrection. And therefore, every Jew believed this. And they believed it because of Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1 and 2. So if you went through the Old Testament, and that's all you had was the Old Testament, could you find the message of salvation? The answer is yes. Yes, you could. It was through the entire Old Testament. And therefore, when you look at the Passion of Christ, and when you look at that passage, you see that it was orchestrated. In other words, it was orchestrated by God, it was controlled by God, and everything was done to prove that Jesus was God. And the fulfillment of the Old Testament. The fulfillment of the Old Testament, which Paul is saying now, I believed, and I am being accused of. And therefore, I am being accused of the very same thing that they uphold themselves. Now, I'm going to stop there, and we're going to, next time, we're going to take the message that Paul has here, and he's going to describe his conversion. He's going to describe his life before his conversion, and therefore he's going to describe the meeting with Jesus Christ, etc. Then he's going to bring it down to today, or to that moment of what Agrippa should do, etc. And then we will see King Agrippa's response to that. And amazingly, it's not much different today than it was then. You get the same reaction, you get the same thoughts, you get the same scenarios. Mankind hasn't changed a whole lot, and therefore we will see how King Agrippa reacts to this. So until next time, I bid you Godspeed from On Victory's Side. We'll see you next week. Welcome to Ray's Reflection, the Common Man's Bible Study. Today we're going to continue with Paul being in Caesarea under house arrest or in prison. And he has stood before Festus and pleaded his cause. And when Festus wanted to take him to Jerusalem, Paul says, no, I'm a Roman citizen and I want to go plead my cause to Caesar. That is my right as a Roman citizen. So in verse 12 of chapter 25, Festus comes to the conclusion. He says, hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar thou shalt go. And so he's got a problem. And he's going to tell you what the problem is, and it's going to take basically from verse 13 to the end of the chapter in which to do it. And his problem is one of law. And obviously he's going to look to someone else to help him. As we look at this, we have to understand why Stephen was allowed by Rome to be stoned by the Jews. In other words, the Jews stoned Stephen and there was no repercussion from the Romans. And Paul, when he was Saul of Tarsus, when he persecuted the church, killed many Christians. And Rome did not step forward. And now all of a sudden you have the Jews who want to kill Paul. In other words, the Jews wanted to kill a Jew, and yet Rome stepped in and protected him. And therefore, what we see is we can look at this and say, okay, the reason Rome didn't do this is because Stephen was not a Roman citizen. Therefore, he fell under the jurisdiction of the Jews. So they left him alone. It was a Jewish matter. But Paul is a Jew, but he's also a Roman. Therefore, he's a Roman citizen, and therefore Rome is, they're going to tell you, does not turn someone over to be killed without first having a trial. I think you need to look further. You need to look further, and I think through all of this narrative passage, where you don't hear teachings on God, you don't hear teachings on the doctrines of the faith or the tenets, you don't see any of that. There's no purpose for Christian living. What you see is you see the providence of God. You see behind the scenes God maneuvering. And what Acts is doing, and I'll go to the end of the book. The book of Acts doesn't end. It's as if someone was interrupted. As someone was writing, Luke was writing the book of Acts, and as he was writing, the doorbell rang, and he got up, and he never came back to finish it. Because what it is a beginning of the work of Christ. You remember in verse 1, what Christ began to do and to teach, and therefore this was just the beginning. And now we see in the early stages of the book of Acts, we see magnificent miracles and the spectacular display of God in the speaking of tongues and the healings and so on, raising of the dead. And as we get to the end of the book, you don't see any of that. You don't see any of that stuff. What you see instead is you see God working behind the scenes. And therefore, in order to understand how Christianity works, you literally have to look behind the scenes. And I am a great one for seeing God work behind the scenes as hindsight. I have a hard time looking forward to seeing where we're headed. But I can look back and say, oh yeah, this is what God did, this is how God maneuvered this, and this occurred, and so on and so forth. I'm great at hindsight. I think most people are. But this is what we see. We see the providence of God. And like most people, we can look backwards and we can see where God worked, etc. And this is basically what we're doing. Okay, now Festus has decided that he's going to send Paul to Rome. But he doesn't have he has a problem. He has a legal problem, and we will see it. And it says this in verse 13. It says this, and after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to greet Festus. Festus being the new governor, and Agrippa being the king. Therefore they're going to come and meet and so on. Now, I have a picture up here of someone who played the part of Bernice. This certainly isn't probably the way she looked. This is one. Evil. Immoral. I don't know how else to describe them. They're just terrible people. In fact, I almost think they're amoral. And you say, well, how come? Well, you will see that Agrippa is the king and Bernice is his sister. And they're in a relationship and they're treating it like they are married. And therefore what you see incest to the max here. Incest at the highest office. And not only that, incest being publicly displayed. And there seems to be absolutely no shame. And Bernice, it's just a terrible, immoral person. If you studied her life, etc., and I haven't, I've taken this from people who have. She had a number of affairs, etc., and every time that affair broke up, etc., she'd come back to Agrippa, and they would get into their sexual relationship, this incest sort of thing, and therefore I find it extremely ironic and extremely ridiculous on the part of man to allow such an immoral person to sit in judgment of such a righteous man. And this is what we have in the world today. We have immoral people. We have people who are extremely liberal, who many do not believe in God. Many have formed their, if they do believe in God, have formed their own concept of what God is, sitting in judgment of people who are Bible believers. They may not be the most sinless people in the world, but they certainly are lovers of God. I just find this extremely, extremely ironic. And one day, God will change us around completely. So when you look at this situation, it's not a good situation. And keep that in mind. This is a very, very wicked, these are very, very wicked people. And when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's case unto the king, saying, there is a certain man left in bonds by Felix. In other words, I inherited a problem. And he's going to bring up that problem. And the reason he's going to bring it up to Agrippa is because the problem he has is the man in bonds is Paul, but the man in bonds is a Jew, and therefore Agrippa is his king. And it says, about whom when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. In other words, the story with he went to Jerusalem about 3 or 4 days after he got to Caesarea to take care of this Paul problem. And they told him in Jerusalem what the problem was. He says, to whom I answered, it is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die before he who is accused have the accuser face to face and have opportunity to answer for himself concerning the accusation laid against him. In other words, he recited to Festus as a reminder. Now remember, it is Rome that is has conquered the Jews. He's telling them, this is how Rome works. We don't turn someone over without first having face-to-face accusations and hearing them out. He says this, therefore when they were come down, in other words, they came down to Caesarea without any delay on the next day, and I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought forth, and I commanded Paul to be brought forth, against whom when the accusers stood up, they brought no accusations of such things I supposed. In other words, when the elders came and delivered their accusations against Paul, he says, totally surprised me. I didn't expect those accusations. I expected them to accuse Paul of committing a crime that Rome was fit and able to judge and adjudicate. And we see that this wasn't so. So he says I was a bit surprised at the accusation. But they had certain questions against him of their own religion. In other words, it was a religious matter. And of this one Jesus. And the issue that Festus brings up is, it says, and they're talking about this man called Jesus, who was dead, whom Paul affirms to be alive. He says, this man Jesus is dead, but Paul says he's alive. He says, I'm not sure that's a crime. He says, and because I was perplexed, in other words, I was confused about this. I mean, here's a man who died on a cross, etc., and this other man over here is saying, no, he's alive. Now, someone isn't getting their story right. He says, such manner of question, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged for this matter. He says, so I asked Paul, I said, are you willing to go to Jerusalem and allow the Sanhedrin, the leaders in Jerusalem, to judge you? But when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of justice, but Paul appealed to Caesar, Augustus Caesar here. Augustus here being the holy one, the high one, the authoritative one. And he says, I commanded him to be kept until I might send him to Caesar. Now here's the problem. How long would he keep him until he sent him to Caesar? Well, he says, then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would also hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, thou shalt hear him. Now, Paul is going, and now it's going to be revealed. In other words, Agrippa is going to hear him on the morrow. It says this, and on the next day, when Agrippa was come, and here comes Bernice with great pomp. In other words, they really celebrated this, and was entered into the place of hearing. This would be the Roman judgment seat sort of thing. And with the chief captains and the principal men of the city, at Festus' command, Paul was brought forth. In other words, everybody of importance was there. And what we see is we see Agrippa and Bernice showing themselves off as the authority. And they did great pomp and absolutely no shame in what they were doing. And Festus says, King Agrippa and all men who are here present with us, ye see this man about whom also the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both in Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. In other words, they want him dead. And you see this man? They want him dead. He says, but when I found that there had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself had appealed to the Augustus, this is basically the authoritative one, I also hear crying that he ought not to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I have determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Here's the problem. And he states his problem. Here's the problem. When a man appealed his case to a higher court, in this case, Paul is appealing to Rome. He's appealing to Caesar, which is his right as a Roman citizen. Then whoever is sending him, the lower courts, whoever is sending him, has to have the accusations, the circumstances, all written down, so that the person receiving it, who's going to review the case, literally has got something to read and something that he can substantiate, can bring before a judge. And Festus did not have it. He didn't even know what to write. And he's looking to Agrippa to find out what he should write to Caesar. In other words, when I write this formal document, what is it I'm going to say? Is basically what he's asking here. Because he doesn't know what to write. So how long will he keep Paul? We don't know, but we do know that he is waiting and hoping King Agrippa gives him some information that he can write down on this document, etc., that he can give to Caesar. And then he says this, wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and specially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination I might have somewhat to write. In other words, after you examine him, maybe you can give me something to write. Now, the reason he's bringing it before Agrippa is because, remember, Festus doesn't understand religious matters. He doesn't understand Jewish religion. He doesn't understand any of these things. He's just a very immoral person. But here comes King Agrippa, who's a Jew, who's king of the Jews, and therefore he understands the Jewish matters. So he's saying, listen, you basically, you understand what's going on here. Therefore, you can hear this man out, and then you can turn around and tell me what I should write to Caesar. That is why King Agrippa is sitting and speaking and going to speak and judge Paul. And that's why Festus turned this basically trial over to Agrippa. There is no case here where Festus had to do this. When King Agrippa and Bernice showed up in Caesarea, Festus just simply had to entertain them, meet with him and talk about ruling and so on and so forth, things that were happening in the kingdom, and let it go that way, and never mention who the prisoners were. He didn't have to do that. So instead he's saying, you can judge Paul because you are a Jew, and you can judge this Jewish matter. And in judging, you can tell me what to write as I write to Caesar. Now the other thing you have to understand is this. Agrippa has no authority here. He has no authority to pass judgment on Paul. Because Festus is not asking Agrippa to determine whether Paul is innocent or guilty and therefore pass a sentence on him. What Festus is asking for is he's asking for you listen to this man, you judge this man, and then you tell me what I should write to Caesar. That is what Festus is writing. In other words, Festus is being very clear to Agrippa that he is not giving up his Roman authority to King Agrippa. And King Agrippa is still under the authority of Rome. Let's understand what's happening here. King Agrippa is not over Festus. Festus is over King Agrippa. But King Agrippa is over the Jews, and therefore he understands Jewish matters. And Festus, wanting to be good with him, asks for his opinion in this matter. And therefore, sometimes we think that Festus is bowing to King Agrippa, and he's not. And therefore, I think this is just a political move on Festus' part to make good between the Jews and the Romans. And instead of going to the Sanhedrin, he goes directly to the king of the Jews. Now we come to chapter 26, and Paul says this. Then Agrippa said then Agrippa said unto Paul, Thou art permitted to speak for thyself. In other words, go ahead and speak. You can speak for yourself. In other words, you don't need a lawyer or someone to speak for you on your behalf. He says, Then Paul stretched forth his hand and answered for himself. I think at this point you have to ask yourself this question. What is Paul going to do? And I have on the PowerPoint here, is he going to take the offense or is he going to take the defense? In other words, is he going to defend himself or is he going to be on the offense? I think if you go back to when Christ gave him a command at his conversion and told him that he would speak to kings and Gentiles and so on, here is a king standing before him. And Paul was going to speak of Jesus Christ. Paul is going to use his life and the evidence in his life to prove that Jesus Christ truly lives. And therefore, you begin to see the defense of the gospel, and he's literally an apologist here. And I believe out of these two words, defense or the offense, I think Paul is on the offense. He's going to take the offense. And if you look at this, he's literally presenting to Agrippa Jesus Christ and an opportunity for Agrippa and Bernice to repent of their sin and accept Christ as their Savior. And we will see this. He says, I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because I shall answer for myself this day before thee concerning all the things of which I am accused of the Jew. In other words, we look at the three things that Paul was accused of. He was accused of usurping the authority of Caesar, and they accused him of being against Caesar. They accused him of being against the Jewish people, and they accused him of being against God or being against the temple. He says, especially because I know thee to be an expert in all customs and questions which are among the Jews. Wherefore I beseech thee to hear me patiently. In other words, he's saying this. Basically what he's saying is this. Now, I'm glad this is happening. He says, because I consider you an expert. In other words, I consider you a person who knows and understands the Jewish mind. And he's not insulting Festus in any way, but Festus does not understand this. And therefore, he doesn't know what to write to Caesar. But Agrippa does understand what's going on. He understands how the Jews feel. He understands why the Sanhedrin want Paul dead. And now he's going to listen to Paul's defense. He says this, my manner of life. I'm going to stop right there. My manner of life. And what he's doing is he's saying, he's looking at it, he says, I've got to prove that what I believe is true. And therefore, not only what I believe, but what I want others to believe and accept is the truth. And therefore, there must be evidence. And I believe the first evidence that we have here that Jesus Christ is alive, Jesus Christ has risen from the dead, Jesus Christ has saved you from your sins, and Jesus Christ can totally change your life, is a transformed life. Look at the evidence. And Paul is going to give you this transformed life. And therefore we have to understand. So he's going to use his own life as an example of what Jesus Christ can do in a person's life. He says this, my manner of life from my youth which was at the first among my own nation at Jerusalem, know all the Jews. In other words, he says, at the beginning, he says, I literally was raised among the Jews. I was raised a Jew in Jerusalem. And all the people in Jerusalem know this. He says, who knew me from the beginning, if they would testify that after the strictest sect of the religion, I lived a Pharisee. In other words, out of all the groups of people who follow the Jewish laws and so on, the Pharisees are the strictest. And in the Pharisees, they were even a strict sect, and I was a member of that. In fact, if we look at his history, etc., he was probably the one being groomed to be the number one Jew concerning the law in Jerusalem. He was a graduate of Gamaliel school. He says, and now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made of God unto our fathers. He says, I'm being judged because I believe the promises that God made in the Old Testament, he says that made unto our fathers. He says, in other words, he says, I studied the Old Testament and I understood the promises. He says this, unto which the promise our 12 tribes, earnestly serving God day and night, hope to come, for which hope, say King Agrippa, I am accused by the Jews. Now, the hope was the hope of the resurrection. And therefore, every Jew believed this. And they believed it because of Daniel chapter 12, and verse 1 and 2. So if you went through the Old Testament, and that's all you had was the Old Testament, could you find the message of salvation? The answer is yes. Yes, you could. It was through the entire Old Testament. And therefore, when you look at the passion of Christ, and when you look at that passage, you see that it was orchestrated. In other words, it was orchestrated by God, it was controlled by God, and everything was done to prove that Jesus was God. And the fulfillment of the Old Testament. The fulfillment of the Old Testament, which Paul is saying now, I believed, and I am being accused of. And therefore, I am being accused of the very same thing that they uphold themselves. Now, I'm going to stop there, and we're going to, next time, we're going to take the message that Paul has here, and he's going to describe his conversion. He's going to describe his life before his conversion, and therefore he's going to describe the meeting with Jesus Christ, etc. Then he's going to bring it down to today, or to that moment of what Agrippa should do, etc. And then we will see King Agrippa's response to that. And amazingly, it's not much different today than it was then. You get the same reaction, you get the same thoughts, you get the same scenarios. Mankind hasn't changed a whole lot, and therefore we will see how King Agrippa reacts to this. So until next time, I bid you Godspeed from On Victory's Side. We'll see you next week.